The year is 1864. Atlanta burns. Flames rise into the night sky, and the sound of exploding ammunition fills the air. Union soldiers march through smoke and rubble, carrying torches that would erase an entire city from the map. When General William Tecumseh Schuman ordered the destruction of Atlanta, his goal was not revenge. It was to break the Confederacy spirit. The city that had fueled the Southern war machine would be left in ruins. Eyewitnesses described the scene as apocalyptic. Buildings cracked and collapsed under the weight of the flames. Railroads melted into twisted metal. Homes, churches, and entire neighborhoods vanished in hours. The fire burned so bright that people could see the glow from miles away. By dawn, Atlanta, the city that once symbolized Southern ambition, was gone. But what happened next was something no one expected. From the ashes, a new city began to form, one that would rise higher and faster than anyone thought possible. To understand how Atlanta could transform from total destruction to a thriving economic powerhouse, we need to go back to where it all began. Before the war, before the name Atlanta existed, when the land was still wild and its future unwritten. Long before railroads and factories, the land that became Atlanta was home to the Creek and Cherokee nations. These indigenous peoples lived across what is now Georgia for centuries. They farmed, traded, and built organized communities with complex systems of governance. The region was rich. Rivers cut through green forests, wildlife was abundant, and the red clay soil could grow crops that sustained entire villages. The Cherokee, in particular, had adopted aspects of European settlement life by the early 1800s. They built schools, churches, and a written constitution. Their capital, New Echota, stood just north of present-day Atlanta, a symbol of cultural strength and resilience. But that peace would not last. As white settlers pushed westward, they saw this land as valuable territory for expansion. The discovery of gold in Dahlonega in 1828, just 80 miles north of Atlanta, made Georgia's native lands even more desirable. Then came the Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Andrew Jackson. Under its authority, federal troops forced the Cherokee and other tribes from their ancestral lands. Thousands died on the journey to the west, a tragedy now known as the Trail of Tears. By the late 1830s, their land was gone. The area was cleared for settlement, and soon surveyors arrived to mark a new destiny for the land, one that would begin with a single line of steel. Most cities are founded for trade, for ports, or for political power. Atlanta was different. It was built for trains. In 1836, the Georgia General Assembly approved a plan to build a railroad from the Midwest to the Atlantic coast, a route that would connect the fertile farmlands of the interior to the port of Savannah. The state hired engineers to find the perfect place to end that line. In 1837, surveyor Stephen Harriman Long drove a stake into the ground near the Chattahoochee River, marking the southern end of the Western and Atlantic Railroad. He called it simply terminus, the Latin word for the end of the line. At first, terminus was barely a settlement, just a few workers' cabins, a blacksmith shop, and a tavern called Whitehall. But the railroad brought people. By the early 1840s, families, merchants, and craftsmen began to settle there, drawn by the promise of trade and opportunity. Then came a new name. In 1843, the town was incorporated as Marthasville, named after Martha Lumpkin, the daughter of Georgia's governor. But residents thought it was too long and not very fitting for a city that wanted to represent movement and modernity. 2 years later, J. Edgar Thompson, the chief engineer of the Georgia Railroad, suggested a new name inspired by the rail line itself, Atlanta, a shortened form of Atlantic. The name stuck. It sounded modern, sleek, forward-thinking, the perfect name for a city built to connect the world. By the 1850s, Atlanta was one of the most strategically important cities in the American South. Railroads from four directions met here: the Western and Atlantic, Georgia, Macon and Western, and Atlanta and West Point lines. The city became a hub for trade, industry, and communication. Cotton from across Georgia was shipped through its depots. Farmers brought livestock and produce to market. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and merchants filled the streets. Atlanta was alive with noise, steam whistles, clanging iron, and the constant rhythm of trains. In 1852, the city had around 2,500 residents. By 1860, that number had swelled to more than 9,500. Hotels, warehouses, and factories lined the streets. It was a city built on motion, young, ambitious, and confident in its destiny. But that destiny was about to be tested. Here's the truth that shaped early Atlanta. Its prosperity depended on slavery. By the time of the Civil War, enslaved African Americans made up nearly half of the city's population. They worked in warehouses, built railroads, and labored in homes. Their forced labor powered the very industries that made Atlanta rich. The city's leaders defended slavery as essential to the Southern way of life. Newspapers spoke proudly of Atlanta's industrial might, but few acknowledged that it rested on the suffering of thousands. The balance could not hold. In 1861, Georgia seceded from the Union. The Confederacy was born, and Atlanta became one of its beating hearts. Its railroads made it a vital supply hub for Confederate armies across the South. Ammunition, weapons, food, and troops all passed through the city. The Confederate rolling mill on Marietta Street produced thousands of artillery shells. Hospitals treated the wounded, and telegraph lines hummed with military orders. Atlanta was no longer just a city. It was the lifeline of the Confederate war effort. But every lifeline can be cut. By 1864, Union General Ulysses S. Grant had a plan to end the war by breaking the South's infrastructure. He ordered General William T. Sherman to march into Georgia and seize Atlanta. The campaign would become one of the most decisive in American history. That spring, Sherman's 100,000-man army began its march from Chattanooga, Tennessee, pushing Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston south through the hills of North Georgia. For months, they clashed in brutal battles: Resaca, Kennesaw Mountain, Peachtree Creek. Each fight pushed the Confederates closer to Atlanta. By July, the Union Army reached the city's outskirts. The sound of cannon fire echoed through its neighborhoods. Civilians fled in panic. Confederate soldiers dug trenches around the city, trying desperately to hold their ground. The siege lasted for weeks. Atlanta's factories were bombed. Rail lines were destroyed. Supplies ran out. Finally, on September 1, 1864, Confederate General John Bell Hood ordered the evacuation of the city. He destroyed what remained of the military stores and fled south. The next day, Union troops marched in. Atlanta had fallen. General Sherman wrote those words to the mayor of Atlanta before ordering the destruction of the city. He gave civilians time to leave, and then began what became known as Sherman's March to the Sea. His soldiers set fire to everything that could support the Confederate cause: depots, factories, rail lines, and warehouses. The fires spread beyond control. Flames leapt from building to building. Explosions ripped through the night as munition stores detonated. By the time it was over, 90% of Atlanta's industrial capacity was gone. Thousands were left homeless. One resident later wrote, "The city looked like a ghost. Only chimneys remained standing, black against the smoke." It was one of the most devastating moments in the city's history. But here's the twist. It was also the beginning of its transformation. When Sherman's army left, Atlanta was a hollow shell. No government, no railroads, no functioning economy. But something remarkable happened.
Within months, people began to return. The first new building constructed after the fire wasn't a courthouse or a mansion. It was a saloon, built to serve the workers who came back to repair the rail lines. Soon after, new shops opened. Churches held services in burned-out shells. Merchants sold supplies from wagons parked on rubble-strewn streets. It was messy. It was improvised. But it was life. By early 1865, the railroads were running again, and with that, Atlanta's heartbeat returned. After the Civil War, Atlanta became a symbol of the South's recovery. It was young, energetic, and determined to prove that destruction didn't mean defeat. Newspapers called it the Phoenix City, rising from the ashes of war. The image stuck and shaped how Atlanta saw itself for generations to come. By 1866, Reconstruction was well underway. New businesses opened every month. Freed African Americans, once enslaved, played a vital role in rebuilding the city, working as carpenters, masons, and laborers. They built not only homes and railroads, but also communities, schools, and churches that would anchor Atlanta's future. The railroads, once symbols of war, became instruments of progress again. Trains carried goods north to the Union States, linking Atlanta to a national economy that was expanding faster than ever before. In just a few years, the city's population doubled. And in 1868, only 3 years after the end of the Civil War, something extraordinary happened. Atlanta was chosen as the new capital of Georgia. The old capital, Milledgeville, was a relic of the antebellum South, rural, traditional, and tied to the Confederacy. Atlanta, by contrast, was new, connected, and brimming with possibility. The decision to move the capital signaled a turning point, politically, economically, and symbolically. It was a declaration that Georgia's future would be urban, industrial, and forward-looking. Government offices, banks, and newspapers began to fill the city. Legislators met in temporary buildings while new state houses were planned. The presence of the state government attracted professionals, investors, and educators. The city was becoming the heart of a new South, not through war, but through rebuilding. By the end of the 1860s, Atlanta was no longer a burned-out ruin. It was one of the fastest-growing cities in the nation. The streets buzzed with life again, carts rolling through mud, children running between new homes, and shopkeepers calling out to passing travelers. But what truly defined Atlanta wasn't its buildings or its railroads. It was its mindset, a relentless belief that no matter how much was destroyed, something greater could be built in its place. That spirit, the refusal to surrender, became Atlanta's defining trait. And it was only the beginning. Because while the city had risen from the ashes, its next challenge was even greater. Learning how to rebuild a society from the wreckage of slavery and war. The coming decades would test whether Atlanta could live up to its own legend, a city reborn not just in body, but in spirit. When the smoke cleared in 1865, Atlanta lay in ruins. The streets were unrecognizable. Charred bricks, twisted rails, empty shells of buildings. Only a few hundred residents remained among what was once a thriving city of thousands. The war had ended, slavery was abolished, and the South was forced to rebuild not only its cities, but its entire way of life. For Atlanta, this wasn't just about survival. It was about rebirth. Within weeks of the Confederacy's surrender, Union troops withdrew and civilians began to trickle back. The first trains rolled through the shattered rail yard that summer, carrying supplies and new settlers. By 1866, makeshift businesses dotted the ruins, blacksmiths, grocers, and carpenters working side by side. But Atlanta's rebuilding wasn't driven by nostalgia for the Old South. It was powered by ambition, the belief that this city could become something modern, something bigger than the world it had lost. In 1868, just 3 years after Sherman's march, Atlanta was chosen as the new capital of Georgia. That decision changed everything. Why Atlanta? The old capital, Milledgeville, symbolized the Confederate past, traditional, agricultural, and tied to slavery. Atlanta, on the other hand, represented motion. It was young, industrial, and rising. The railroad connections that once made it a wartime target now made it the perfect hub for a new political and economic order. When the Georgia state government officially moved its offices to Atlanta, it sent a clear message. This is where the future of the South begins. New buildings filled the skyline. The population surged as people from across Georgia, freedmen, merchants, and former soldiers, arrived seeking work. By 1870, Atlanta's population had nearly tripled since the war's end. But not everyone was rebuilding on equal ground. The end of slavery didn't mean the end of struggle. For newly freed African Americans, Atlanta was both a beacon of hope and a place of constant risk. Freedom offered opportunities, but also brought new forms of oppression. Still, they built. Black churches became centers of community life, places of safety, worship, and education. The Big Bethel AME Church, founded in 1847, emerged as one of the most important institutions in the city. Schools for freedmen opened, including Atlanta University in 1865, one of the first historically black colleges in the nation. Education became an act of resistance, a way to claim dignity in a world determined to deny it. Meanwhile, white leaders in Atlanta promoted a new vision of progress they called the New South. This phrase, made famous by newspaper editor Henry Grady, symbolized a shift from the old plantation economy to industry, business, and urban development. Grady and his allies painted Atlanta as the model of modern Southern identity, forward-thinking, open to commerce, and loyal to the Union again. They wanted investors from the North to see Atlanta not as a symbol of defeat, but as a land of opportunity. It worked. By the 1880s, new factories, mills, and warehouses filled the city. Cotton remained king, but now it was spun, dyed, and shipped from Atlanta's industrial centers rather than the fields. Rail lines expanded in every direction, making the city the undisputed transportation capital of the South. But beneath this progress was tension, because not everyone shared in it. The New South was built on old inequalities. White elites grew rich from trade and development, while black citizens faced new systems of control. The promise of freedom collided with segregation laws, discrimination, and violence. But despite these obstacles, a powerful black middle class began to emerge in Atlanta. Business owners, educators, and clergy who refused to be silenced. Alonzo Herndon, born into slavery, built successful enterprises after emancipation. Herndon founded the Atlanta Life Insurance Company, one of the most prosperous black-owned businesses in America. His rise became a symbol of what was possible in the face of racial oppression. As the century closed, Atlanta's skyline changed again. Brick replaced wood. Gas lights illuminated the streets. Streetcars crisscrossed the city, connecting neighborhoods to new commercial centers. And then came 1881, the year that would put Atlanta on the map for good. That year, the International Cotton Exposition opened in Piedmont Park. The event drew hundreds of thousands of visitors from around the country. It was designed to show that the South was ready to rejoin the national economy, that it could produce, innovate, and compete. The exposition was a triumph. Newspapers called Atlanta the Phoenix City, rising from the ashes of war. It became a defining image that still shapes how Atlanta sees itself today, a place that never stays down for long. But for every triumph, there was a shadow. Rapid growth brought deep social divides. The city's black population was growing quickly, confined to segregated districts, excluded from most skilled jobs, and targeted by discriminatory laws. And in 1906, the tension exploded. That September, rumors spread through white newspapers accusing black men of attacking white women, stories that were exaggerated and unverified. Within hours, mobs of white men stormed through downtown Atlanta, beating and killing African Americans, destroying homes and businesses. The Atlanta Race Massacre of 1906 left dozens dead, the exact number never confirmed, and hundreds injured.
It was one of the darkest chapters in the city's history, a brutal reminder that the so-called New South was still chained to old hatred. Yet, even after the bloodshed, Atlanta's black community rebuilt again. They established new business districts, such as Sweet Auburn Avenue, which would later become one of the most prosperous black neighborhoods in America, and the birthplace of a leader who would change the world, Martin Luther King Jr. By the 1910s, the city had transformed into one of the South's most industrialized economies. Cotton mills, furniture factories, and ironworks filled its outskirts. Downtown, elegant department stores and theaters stood beside warehouses and rail yards. Streetcars clanged through Peachtree Street, carrying workers, businessmen, and students. The skyline was growing, small by today's standards, but a proud symbol of renewal. And yet, life in Atlanta was divided along rigid racial lines. Segregation laws dictated where people could live, work, and learn. Public facilities, from streetcars to water fountains, were separated by color. For white leaders, Atlanta was the city too busy to hate. But for black residents, hate was never far away. Still, black Atlanta found ways to build its own power. Along Sweet Auburn Avenue, black entrepreneurs, ministers, and educators created a thriving community. It became the center of African American culture and business in the city, known as the richest Negro street in the world. Banks, insurance companies, and newspapers flourished there. The Atlanta Daily World, founded in 1928, became one of the most influential black newspapers in America. Education also continued to rise as a pillar of progress. The Atlanta University Center, a consortium of historically black colleges and universities, grew into one of the leading centers of black higher education. It included schools such as Spelman College, Morehouse College, and Clark Atlanta University, all producing generations of future leaders. These institutions shaped minds that would later guide the civil rights movement. Then came the Great Depression. The economic collapse of the 1930s hit Atlanta hard. Factories closed, rail traffic declined, and thousands lost their jobs. Breadlines formed in the shadows of once prosperous businesses. But the city's leaders, both black and white, refused to let Atlanta slide backward. They pushed for federal relief programs, bringing New Deal projects into the city. Roads, parks, and public buildings were constructed, laying the foundation for modern infrastructure. The resilience that had defined Atlanta since the Civil War carried it through again. And as the economy began to recover, another challenge loomed, one that would reshape the entire nation: World War II. During the 1940s, Atlanta became a center for wartime production. Factories built aircraft parts and military supplies. Bell Aircraft Corporation opened a massive plant nearby, employing tens of thousands, including many women and African Americans entering industrial jobs for the first time. The war boosted the city's economy and its demographics. Thousands of rural Southerners migrated to Atlanta seeking work. By 1950, the population had surged past 330,000. But change brought pressure.
Housing shortages grew, segregation tightened, white suburbs expanded while black neighborhoods were left overcrowded and underfunded. The tension was building again. And then, amid the growing unrest, Atlanta gave birth to a voice that would echo across the world. In 1929, a child was born in a small house on Auburn Avenue, Martin Luther King, Jr. The son of a Baptist minister, King grew up in the heart of Black Atlanta, surrounded by the faith, education, and activism that defined the community. By the 1950s, Atlanta was no longer just a southern city. It was the center of a national movement for equality. When the civil rights movement began, Atlanta became its strategic base. The city's black leaders, ministers, educators, and business owners used their influence to challenge segregation through courts, protests, and nonviolent resistance. King and his allies at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, operated out of Atlanta, organizing campaigns that reached Montgomery, Birmingham, and beyond. But while other southern cities erupted in violence, Atlanta tried a different path. City leaders adopted a policy of negotiation, progress through compromise rather than confrontation. They wanted to protect the city's reputation as too busy to hate. And yet, the struggle was real. Students from Morehouse College and Spelman College led sit-ins across downtown in 1960, challenging segregated lunch counters. The arrests drew national attention and local support. Eventually, many businesses began to desegregate quietly, seeking peace over publicity. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. During this era of turmoil, Atlanta was also booming economically. The city's business leaders understood that racial violence would scare away investors. So they began to back moderate reforms. Mayor Ivan Allen Jr., elected in 1961, played a crucial role. He publicly supported civil rights legislation, making Atlanta one of the few southern cities to embrace federal desegregation orders without massive resistance. New industries arrived. The airport expanded. Skyscrapers rose. By the 1960s, Atlanta had become a symbol of what the South could be: modern, integrated, and forward-looking. But the cost of progress was uneven. Many black neighborhoods were bulldozed for highways and urban renewal projects. Communities were displaced in the name of modernization. Once again, Atlanta was growing, but not everyone was growing with it. Through the 1970s and 1980s, Atlanta transformed from a regional capital to a national powerhouse. The city elected its first black mayor, Maynard Jackson, in 1973, a historic milestone not only for Atlanta, but for the entire nation. Jackson expanded opportunities for minority-owned businesses, pushed for fair hiring, and oversaw the massive expansion of Hartsfield Airport, which would later become one of the busiest in the world. His leadership reshaped Atlanta's identity, a place where black political power and economic influence could coexist with white business interests. Under his administration, the city became a model for urban governance during a time when many American cities struggled with decline. In the 1980s, Atlanta's population grew again as it positioned itself as the unofficial capital of the New South. The skyline exploded with new towers. Bank of America Plaza, Peachtree Center, and the Westin Peachtree Plaza became icons of modernity. The city became home to major corporations like Coca-Cola, Delta Airlines, and CNN. By the 1990s, it was clear Atlanta had succeeded where few southern cities had. It had reinvented itself entirely. But the journey wasn't over. Because beneath the glittering skyline and the booming economy, the question remained: could Atlanta truly overcome the divisions of its past? The same city that once burned in the fires of war now stood as a symbol of progress. The same streets that witnessed racial terror now hosted parades of unity and celebration. And yet, the struggles that built Atlanta, between race and progress, power and inequality, never disappeared. They only evolved.